Vladimir Putin has built his entire presidency on the promise of inevitability. The idea that Russia is too large to contain, too determined to stop, and too nuclear to seriously confront. For 4 years, that premise held the battlefield in a kind of brutal equilibrium. Enough destruction to prevent Ukrainian victory, not enough to prevent Ukrainian survival. But in March 2026, something shifted. The signals were subtle at first, buried in operational assessments and diplomatic communiques, then they became impossible to ignore. Ukraine, the country that was supposed to collapse in 72 hours in February 2022, is now doing something that no one inside the Kremlin's planning rooms had ever fully wargamed. It is simultaneously winning on the battlefield, reshaping the global balance of power with its technology, building a security architecture that could permanently lock Russia out of influence over Central Europe, and leveraging the Middle East crisis in ways that are isolating Moscow at precisely the moment Putin thought geography and patience had finally turned in his favor. Rather than inducing moderation, the apparent equilibrium of power on the front lines is driving escalation, and Ukraine, as the weaker combatant, is now being incentivized to escalate to escape the attritional clash that Russia had always bet would eventually exhaust Kiev first. To understand what Putin is alarmed about, you have to start with the battlefield itself, because the story the numbers tell is not the one the Kremlin wants the world to read. Russian military casualties have reached an estimated 1.2 million killed and wounded since February 2022, according to Western officials cited by Bloomberg and the Wall Street Journal, including as many as 325,000 killed. That is a figure that strains the social fabric of any nation, but especially one where a record high of 67% of Russians now support peace negotiations, according to a mid-February 2026 poll, while only 38% favor continuing the military operation. Putin is prosecuting a war of maximalist imperial ambition against the expressed preference of a clear majority of his own population. He can manage that contradiction for now, but it is a contradiction that compounds interest every month the war continues. Sending Russian soldiers home could pose challenges to Putin's narrative and reveal how much the war has truly cost Russian society, while the Kremlin is simultaneously aware that returning veterans who have been publicly lauded as heroes could pose a credible future political challenge. Putin does not want peace, but he is also deeply afraid of what winning or losing looks like domestically. Meanwhile, on the actual front lines in eastern Ukraine, something operationally significant is underway. Ukrainian forces struck 55 Russian air defense systems during the winter of 2025-2026, and a further 23 systems between March 1st and 16th alone, for a total of 80 systems destroyed in just a few months, a concentrated, systematic campaign to dismantle the very shield behind which Russian artillery and aviation have operated. This is not random attrition. This is deliberate, sequenced, and strategic. Ukraine's degradation of the Russian air defense network through concentrated strikes against radars and air defense systems allows subsequent Ukrainian strikes to target other valuable assets in the Russian rear, enhancing the reach of Ukraine's mid-range battlefield interdiction campaign. Every Russian S-300 or Panzer destroyed this winter is a hole in the umbrella that previously protected Russian logistics, command posts, and ammunition depots from Ukrainian long-range strikes. Ukraine is not just surviving the Russian spring offensive, it is methodically removing the preconditions that would make a Russian breakthrough possible. The competing dilemmas that Ukraine has imposed on the Russian military command have likely disrupted Russian preparations for their spring-summer 2026 offensive. In the south, the picture is equally arresting. Ukrainian leadership has claimed Ukrainian forces have recaptured 400 square kilometers in the southern Zaporizhzhia Oblast in recent weeks, according to reporting from mid-March 2026. Those are not phantom kilometers. They represent a deliberate Ukrainian push to consolidate defensive depth and deny Russian forces the forward staging areas they need to mount credible advances toward Zaporizhzhia city, a critical industrial hub whose loss would fundamentally alter the war's economic calculus. The goal, as commanders fighting in the south told reporters personally, was to push Russian forces back by identifying and clearing areas of infiltration and troop concentration, allowing the Ukrainian defense to better consolidate ahead of spring. Ukraine is not counterattacking for optics. It is shaping the terrain for the campaign it knows is coming in April and May, when the ground hardens and Russian armored columns attempt to reassert momentum across multiple axes simultaneously. But this is where things become truly dangerous for the Kremlin, because the military situation is only one dimension of a multi-domain challenge that is now converging on Moscow from directions Putin never anticipated. The Iran war, which erupted on February 28th when the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury, has produced a geopolitical earthquake whose aftershocks are hitting Russia directly. Putin called for an immediate cessation of hostilities regarding Iran on March 6th, a remarkable statement from a man who has continuously refused to allow a ceasefire in Ukraine that would enable meaningful peace negotiations there. The hypocrisy was noted globally and immediately. Putin is demanding that Washington stop a war he approves of, while refusing to stop a war he started. But beyond the hypocrisy, the Iran crisis has exposed something structurally damaging to Russia's strategic position. It has made Ukraine indispensable, globally visible, and diplomatically powerful at the very moment Putin thought isolation and winter had finally broken Kiev's will. Russia was reportedly sharing targeting intelligence with Iranian forces, feeding data on U.S. troops, warships, and aircraft to Iranian operators striking American and Allied assets in the Gulf, an act of proxy warfare against the United States that has made the prospect of any genuine Russia-U.S. rapprochement essentially impossible in the near term. While Moscow was presenting a friendly facade toward Washington in Ukraine negotiations, it was simultaneously helping kill American servicemen in the Middle East. ISW assessed that Russia is likely only maintaining a friendly facade toward the United States as a means of persuading Washington to abandon Ukraine in ongoing peace negotiations and secure an unwarranted reset of U.S.-Russia relations, allowing Russia to more easily accomplish its long-standing goal of destroying the Ukrainian state. That assessment, once a matter of analytical debate, is now confirmed by Russia's own actions in the Gulf. The mask is off, and every NATO defense minister, every wavering European parliamentarian, every undecided Gulf state monarch has seen clearly whose side Moscow is on. And into this vacuum of Russian credibility, Ukraine has walked with remarkable strategic composure. Ukraine's drone industry is abuzz with anticipation of a deal that would allow it to sell interceptor drones abroad, hoping for the first big relaxation of wartime export restrictions that would finally put Ukrainian technology in the hands of foreign militaries amid the U.S. war with Iran. President Zelensky is seemingly holding out for a deal over PAC-3 missiles, an anti-air munition for Patriot systems that is uniquely effective at defending against Russian ballistic attacks. Read that sentence again and absorb its strategic weight. Ukraine possesses a technology that the United States and its Gulf partners desperately need right now, today, to defend against the same Iranian drones that Russia taught Tehran to employ against Kiev. And Zelensky is not giving it away. He is trading it for the advanced air defense munitions that his own country needs to survive Russia's ballistic missile campaign. Ukraine has turned 4 years of suffering into the world's most valuable military currency, and it is now spending that currency with the discipline of a grandmaster, not a supplicant. The diplomatic architecture taking shape around Ukraine simultaneously represents the most serious structural threat to Russian ambition since 2022. The United Kingdom and France have committed that, in the event of a ceasefire, they will establish military hubs across Ukraine and build protected facilities for weapons and military equipment to support Ukraine's defensive needs. These are not vague political promises. They are detailed military commitments from two nuclear-armed NATO members, the only European nations with both the nuclear deterrent and the expeditionary track record to make such guarantees credible. Ukraine and the United States finalized a 20-point security framework covering security guarantees involving Ukraine, the United States, and European partners, with a separate bilateral document outlining specific conditions under which security will be provided in the event of another Russian assault, and a mechanism to monitor any ceasefire. That framework, a 20-point plan that Zelensky himself acknowledged was imperfect but real, represents something Putin has spent 3 years trying to prevent: a legally binding security architecture for Ukraine that does not require NATO membership but achieves much of the same deterrent effect. Ukraine agreed to an unconditional ceasefire as far back as March 2025, but Putin refused to follow suit. Instead, he spent much of the past year engaging in blatant stalling tactics while constantly moving the diplomatic goalposts in a transparent bid to prevent any progress toward a lasting settlement. The most recent escalation saw Russia attempt to freeze millions of Ukrainians in their own homes by systematically bombing critical heating and power infrastructure amid Arctic conditions. That winter bombing campaign, which destroyed or damaged at least two-thirds of Ukraine's energy production capacity, according to Western military officials, was meant to break Kiev's social cohesion and force a capitulation. Instead, it hardened European resolve, accelerated European rearmament, and provided vivid evidence to the global South that Russia's war aims are not limited, not defensive, and not negotiable. Putin is operating on a completely different wavelength than a leader seeking a compromise peace. To Trump, the negotiations are a geopolitical real estate deal. In reality, Putin's motivation is a historical psychological obsession with Ukraine. That obsession is now colliding with arithmetic that is becoming impossible for the Kremlin to ignore. 4 years into fighting back an unprovoked full-scale invasion, Ukraine's army is keeping Russian forces to marginal gains while simultaneously extracting exorbitant costs in lives and treasure, with front lines remaining broadly stable despite this being the most difficult winter for Ukrainian civilians because of Russian attacks on the power grid. Russia is paying 1 million casualties for territory that amounts, in the words of one analyst, to a series of villages and tree lines, marginal tactical gains that have not and cannot produce the strategic breakthrough Putin promised his military would deliver in days back in February 2022. 4 years of war have revealed that Putin's goals are beyond Moscow's actual grasp. Instead of securing Russia's western flank, the full-scale invasion has unified Ukraine and transformed it into a country that will be permanently hostile to Russia, aggrieved and intent on joining the European Union and NATO. What happens next is the question that keeps every defense analyst awake. The Kremlin confirmed on March 19th that peace talks between Washington, Moscow, and Kiev were on a situational pause following the start of the Iran war, a convenient pretext for a negotiating posture that was already going nowhere. Zelensky met with U.S. envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner in Florida on March 22nd, calling for tougher action against Russia's shadow oil fleet and for it to be denied revenues that fund the very army shelling Ukrainian cities every single night. Meanwhile, on the ground, as of March 23rd, Ukraine's defenders recorded 134 combat engagements in a single day, repelling attempts by Russian forces to advance across multiple sectors, while inflicting 970 casualties on Russian personnel in that 24-hour period alone. The war is not pausing. It is not freezing. It is being fought at industrial intensity every day while diplomats talk, and every day that passes without a ceasefire, Ukraine's military knowledge base deepens, its drone industrial complex expands, its international partnerships solidify, and the case for Russia's eventual strategic defeat grows more, not less, compelling. The strategic conclusion that emerges from everything unfolding in early 2026 is one that the Kremlin cannot safely acknowledge but cannot avoid calculating. Ukraine is not about to collapse under military pressure. It is not about to collapse under diplomatic pressure. It has, against all probability, emerged from 4 years of existential war as the world's leading counter-drone power, a credible diplomatic actor with a security architecture under construction, and a nation whose suffering has permanently foreclosed any path back to Russian dominion. Putin finds himself trapped in a war he cannot win but dare not end, unable to achieve the total victory his rhetoric demands, and unable to accept the settlement his population increasingly desires. What Ukraine is doing that is genuinely war-ending is not a single dramatic battlefield maneuver. It is something more patient, more sophisticated, and ultimately more lethal to Russian imperial ambition. It is building, month by month, the conditions under which continuing this war costs Russia more than ending it. When that calculation finally tips inside the Kremlin, the war will end. And the tipping point is closer than Putin will ever publicly admit.